Hi, this is David Miller, and I'm here with the 8th in a series of mini-lectures on Charles Dickens's Great Expectations. Today we're going to start Volume 3, and we will be mapping the action. Volume 3 unfolds the same way Volume 2 did. There are 2 movements of 8 chapters each, and a closing movement of 4 chapters. In this video we'll cover the first 2 movements, Uncle Provis and Into the Fire. We'll wind things up next time with the novel's conclusion. Here's a look at the first movement. As Volume 3 opens, we learn that Magwitch has a first name, Abel. Earlier, I compared Pip's evil twin Orlick to Cain, and you might wonder now why Pip isn't the one associated with Abel, if Great Expectations is supposed to be a modern retelling of the biblical beloved son narrative. I think he is, but the connection's indirect. It's kind of backward. When Magwitch returns, Pip becomes his caretaker, buying him clothes, finding him lodging, planning his escape from England. In a way, this reverses their roles, since Magwitch has been Pip's secret benefactor for years. In another way, it renews their first acquaintance. Magwitch is once again a fugitive, and Pip, in spite of the horror he feels, is once again forced to care for the escaped convict, bound to him by a guilty secret. I said the first time that Pip corresponds to Isaac, the sacrificial figure bent backward under the blade of his father's knife. But by returning to England, Magwitch is sacrificing himself, risking death out of love and gratitude. In this way, Dickens reverses the story. He turns the sacrificing Abraham of the novel's first scene into the sacrificial father of its final volume, naming him not Abraham Magwitch, but Abel, with the dastardly Compeyson as his Cain. Magwitch tells Pip and Herbert his life story, another piece in the novel's gradual excavation of its buried past. Pip then goes to say goodbye to Estella and Miss Havisham before leaving the country. Chapter 5 gives us Pip's declaration of love for Estella. Broken words, he calls them, that welled up within me like blood from an inward wound and gushed out. This is a crucial moment because of the effect it has on Miss Havisham. For more than 20 years, she has felt no connection to any human being, and she has taught Estella to feel none either. She began to realize her mistake late in Volume 2, discovering to her outrage Estella doesn't even love her. The revelation is completed when she sees her own suffering mirrored in Pip's ecstasy of unhappiness. This moment recalls Pip's very first impulse of pity for Magwitch in the churchyard. In each case, the feeling of pity arises from recognition, leading to identification. The one who feels the pity sees himself or herself in the one who suffers. And in each case, the compassionate impulse gives rise to a cycle of generosity. Pip has come to ask Miss Havisham if she will assist Herbert now that he can no longer do so. She will agree to this the next time Pip sees her, because she has felt compassion for his suffering and seeks his forgiveness. This turning point isn't directly connected to the events surrounding Magwitch, but it does mirror them, for it enacts the same progress from pride and shame back to guilt and forgiveness that Pip must also work through in relation to his convict. The larger movement of Volume 3 is based on this progress, from awareness and identification through compassion to redemptive action. The cycle of generosity begins when awareness leads to identification. And so Miss Havisham's awareness that she too is unloved by Estella prepares her for the moment in which she identifies with Pip. The moment of identification gives rise to compassion. And so Miss Havisham's identification with Pip enables her to feel compassion for his broken heart, and also to recognize her own responsibility for it. Her compassion then provides the motive for redemptive action. The same sequence informs different lines of action, relating them to a common pattern. Awareness of the self and the other leads to identification with the other, which leads to compassion and pity. And I think the next time I revise this slide set, I'm going to add a recognition of responsibility as well. And this leads to redemptive action. The emphasis on awareness as the first moment in this progress is no accident. Remember the care with which Dickens in the novel's opening scene pinpoints the moment when Pip first becomes aware of himself and his place in the world? I read this passage aloud the first time. I think I'll just let this be a reminder. Dickens gives this moment such emphasis because the growth of this first flicker of self-consciousness is the main arc of Pip's development as a character. Dickens is equally careful to provide a parallel moment of emerging into self-awareness for Magwitch.
"I've no more notion where I was born than you have, if so much. I first became aware of myself down in Essex, a-thieving turnips for my living. Someone had run away from me, a man, a tinker, and he took the fire with him and left me wery cold."
This parallel is one of a number of similarities that link these two characters. Both of them begin their lives conscious of a sense of rupture and abandonment. Both are cut off from any patriline. As his relationship to Magwitch develops in Volume 3, Pip goes through a more elaborate version of the progress we've been seeing, from awareness to redemption. There is an initial shock in which he seems, for a moment, to lose the awareness of himself. All this time I had never been able to consider my own situation, nor could I do so yet. I had not the power to attend to it. I was greatly dejected and distressed, but in an incoherent, wholesale sort of way. I thought how miserable I was, but hardly knew why, or how long I had been so, or on what day of the week I made the reflection, or even who I was that made it. This is followed by feelings of revulsion. I would sit and look at him, wondering what he had done, and loading him with all the crimes in the calendar, until the impulse was powerful on me to start up and fly from him. Once, I actually did start out of bed in the night and begin to dress myself in my worst clothes, hurriedly intending to leave him there with everything else I possessed and enlist for India as a private soldier. Once he recovers a sense of himself, Pip must then recognize the truth of his relation to Magwitch. Pip is ever aware that Magwitch has spent years accumulating the wealth that Pip has been living on, and that Magwitch has risked his life just to lay eyes on Pip. Hearing Magwitch's history only solidifies Pip's awareness of Magwitch's sacrifice. That recognition leads to identification. It struck me that he was softened, indefinably, for I could not have said how, and could never afterwards recall how when I tried. I'll explain this one further in just a moment. Identification leads to compassion. I was so struck by the horror of this idea, which had weighed upon me from the first, and the working out of which would make me regard myself in some sort as his murderer. If Provis were recognized and taken in spite of himself, I should be wretched as the cause, however innocently. And finally, to redemptive action, as Pip and Herbert attempt to rescue Magwitch. We see this process underway as the first movement of Volume 3 closes, for Pip is identifying with his convict more and more. The passage I just quoted about Pip's impression that Magwitch was somehow softened actually tells us that his heart has begun to soften toward Magwitch. Perhaps this moment will remind us of Wemmick gazing on the aged P with his hard face, really softened. Or perhaps it will remind us of what Pip says about himself in Volume 2, when Joe comes to dinner in London. I had neither the good sense nor the good feeling to know that Joe's exceeding awkwardness was all my fault, and that if I had been easier with Joe, Joe would have been easier with me. If Magwitch now seems easier with Pip, perhaps we may guess that this is so because Pip is easier with him. Pip's other relationships play out variations on this pattern. His first visit to Satis House in Volume 3 occasions his shock and revulsion. His return leads him through stages of awareness, compassion, and redemptive action that match Miss Havisham's. Pip's recognition of Miss Havisham's role would be impossible without a corresponding recognition about Estella's true nature, and so we see yet another version of the pattern, ending in Pip's compassion for Estella and his unselfish pleading with her, for her own sake, to marry anyone but Drummle. These last developments take us into the second movement of Volume 3, which begins with another dinner party at the stately London residence of Mr. Jaggers, after which Wemmick tells Pip more of the backstory, enough for Pip to guess that the woman who keeps house for Jaggers is Estella's mother. Then Pip returns to Satis House. At the end of the scene, Miss Havisham, having generously provided for Herbert and his family, literally goes up in flame. Her ancient wedding dress catches fire as she sits by the hearth. Pip tries to come to her rescue and is badly burned. This is the first of two encounters that hark back to Volume 1. That was where we learned that Orlick, working at Joe's forge, told a young and timid Pip that it was necessary to make up the fire once in 7 years with a live boy, and that I might consider myself fuel. The second encounter that harks back to this moment comes in Chapter 14, when Orlick binds Pip in the Limehouse, repeatedly declaring that he intends to murder him and drag his body to the kiln. He puts a candle to Pip's face, laughing and gloating that the burnt child dreads the fire. Old Orlick knowed you was burnt. As the action of the novel gathers to its close, there are many such echoes of its beginning. These echoes signal to us that Pip is working his way back to the origins of his story. As I've been saying, this happens on the level of plot as the backstory that links Magwitch to Estella and Miss Havisham finally comes to light. It happens on a psychological and symbolic level when Pip is bound in the Limehouse and threatened with death, for in this moment he has worked his way back to the novel's opening scene. Facing his imminent death in a heightened state of consciousness, a wild inward hurry, he calls it, so intense that he is thinking in pictures instead of words, Pip experiences the second turning point of his life. The first, remember, occurred when Magwitch returned and the figurative roof collapsed. The second occurs now as Pip faces death at the hands of his sister's killer. This moment is a turning point because in facing Orlick, Pip resolves his lifelong sense of guilt. I said, remember, that guilt differs from shame because it can be forgiven, and we see Pip seeking forgiveness as he looks death in the face. Softened, and notice that word, softened as my thoughts of all the rest of men were in that dire extremity, he says, humbly beseeching pardon as I did of heaven, melted at heart as I was by the thought that I had taken no farewell. But even as he asks pardon for the wrongs he has done, Pip repudiates the guilt that Orlick tries to shift onto him.
It was you as did for your shrew sister. I tell you it was your doing. You've done it. Now you pays for it.
Pip has been a weak, essentially passive character for most of the novel, but in this moment he finds the strength to assert his own truth.
It was you, villain, said I.
And this is crucial. At the age of 7, Pip had neither the strength of mind to resist intimidation, nor the confidence to believe in his own innocence. Now he finds both. This new determination is linked to Pip's prayer for forgiveness. The passage I quoted just now doesn't end with Pip beseeching pardon and melted at heart. Softened as my thoughts were, he says, humbly beseeching pardon as I did, melted at heart as I was by the thought that I could never ask for their compassion on my miserable errors. Still, if I could have killed him, even in dying, I would have done it. This shows that Pip has finally broken through to a clear sense of himself. The same strength that enables him to accept the guilt that belongs to him and seek forgiveness for it also lets him repudiate false guilt and fight for his life. This is Pip's conversion experience. When it is over, he will be ready to stand by Magwitch on trial and in prison. That is where the third and final movement begins. But we'll save that for next time.